If you were raised by a borderline parent, here's what you need to know. Did you tend to feel any of these ways with your parent growing up? Were you never sure what to expect from them? That in certain moments they would seem thrilled with life and with you, but at other moments would treat you with such hostility, contempt, and rage that they could seem like almost two different people? Was there a pull to get caught up in the drama? That your parent was overly invested in the goings-on of other people, always talking about them, measuring themselves by them, and shifting their loyalties amongst them? And were you wary of this parent's motives? Did they seem to always be positioning you or situations in ways that were designed to benefit them? And did you find yourself feeling very cautious during separations from this parent? Whether it was getting off the phone first, or going to work or school, or seeking the company of other important people in your life. Did these sort of typically expected and normal transitions towards other people and other focuses of attention seem to trigger bouts of rage, tantrums, accusations of cruelty or callousness, or tactics to get you to give up your plans and stay with that parent? And did you find yourself feeling even more cautious at reunions with that parent after a separation, where it may have felt impossible to guess how you'd be greeted, whether it be joyful glee, rage, or indifference? Well, if any of these points reflected your experience with a parent, then you may have survived a different but related form of abuse that I talk about on this channel, and that is abuse by someone with borderline personality disorder. And sometimes in families, there can be one parent who's narcissistic and the other is borderline. Well, if you've determined that one of your parents kind of corresponds to the narcissistic abuse that's talked about on the channel and elsewhere, and that today's video kind of captures how the other parent was, then you may have survived both narcissistic and borderline abuse in your family of origin. And in today's video, I'm going to explain what borderline personality disorder is, how it's different and similar to narcissistic personality disorder, and give an example of what borderline personality can look like in a parent. Well, my name's Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and I specialize in helping people recover from bad childhoods. And often these bad childhoods take the form of having a narcissistic parent, and I have an online course and Facebook community that's devoted to recovery from this type of abuse. And today I'm going to extend that discussion to the experience and recovery from having a borderline parent. And if you find these kinds of videos useful, then I encourage you to check the subscribe button below and turn on notifications so that you know when a new video gets posted. Well, what is borderline personality disorder? Borderline personality refers to how psychologically and emotionally developed someone has been permitted to become. And there's a prominent psychoanalyst named Otto Kernberg who I think very usefully characterizes borderline personality as having a state of arrested development psychologically by the person who has it or suffers from it. And he cites three characteristics of someone with a borderline level of psychological development, and here's what they are. The first is, in essence, a flimsy sense of core identity, that they can feel like sort of different people from one situation or relationship to the next, and they have a difficult time feeling whole from within. Some describe a terrifying sense of inner emptiness that must be kind of constantly staved off. And the second characteristic is seeing people as either all good or all bad in very distorted ways. So small frustrations in relationships become reasons for wholesale rejection and attack, while other people or other situations with the same person can make minor acts of kindness seem like gifts from heaven. So the borderline person is often stuck either totally devaluing or grossly idealizing other people and themselves. And this is a way of seeing others and oneself that in the psychology world we call splitting. And the third characteristic, which can often be confusing for the sort of victim of this kind of abuse, is that the person with borderline personality generally has good contact with reality. That the person doesn't suffer from hallucinations, delusions, or other more sort of obvious psychotic breaks from reality. And this is one thing that can make a relationship with them be so threatening to your own sense of reality. That if you're unfortunate enough to be the devalued person for the borderline person in a moment, then the seeming intactness of their contact with reality can make their assaults on your character feel believable and leave you wondering if they know you better than you thought you knew yourself. And I think that borderline personality is, in essence, a story of attachment gone awry. That the person with this condition feels terrifyingly insecure in the strength of the bonds that connect them to others and in the strength of the bonds connecting others to them. And relatedly, the lack of strength of the bond connecting themselves within. And sort of tragically, when they experience moments of attachment or sort of good feeling with another person, these moments seem to be, to the borderline person, unjustly and horrifyingly interrupted in ways that send the person with the borderline personality into an abyss of rejection, self-loathing, and sort of an abandonment, and feeling like they are nobody to no one. And they can live under the constantly looming threat of this sort of terrifying abandonment experience, and or get taken over by feeling too close to someone. And that's something in the psychology world we call a fear of being engulfed by the other if the closeness grows to be too much. And as a result, normal transitions in day-to-day life can sort of feel re-traumatizing for the person with borderline personality, and can often result in them traumatizing those around them in their efforts to cope. And by transition, I mean some sort of change in one's current state into a different state and set of circumstances. So some sort of separation and or reunion is always a part of a transition. In these moments, a person with borderline personality is particularly susceptible to seeing others and or themselves as either all good or all bad. And here's why. A parent with borderline personality could feel the trauma of abandonment just by their child doing something normal, like running away from them to go play with their friends on the playground. And in that moment, the parent feels rejected and has this sort of pseudo choice of either feeling all bad to themselves, and like the child gets to sort of gleefully rub their noses in how bad and worthless the parent is, or this person with borderline personality can relocate that all bad feeling and see the child as the bad one who has so sort of maliciously made the parent feel abandoned in this way. And this latter strategy saves the borderline parent from feeling that abandonment terror, but of course puts that child in a very, very bad position. Well, let's say that same child realizes that he needs to stay close to his parent to prevent that borderline parent from getting so angry with the child. Well, as the child tries to say hug and cling to the parent, then that borderline parent may now experience the child's attempts at closeness to be too much, or to be threatening engulfment to that parent. And in this case, the parent may see the child as trying to take over that borderline parent's sort of self and leave the parent with no autonomy of his or her own. Now the borderline person is not feeling abandonment, but rather sort of too much attachment, a sort of engulfment that's brought on by a lack of a clear boundary between the feeling of oneself and the other person. So the borderline parent may then come up with a reason why he or she has to reject the child who's trying to get close to the borderline parent. Something like, oh, your hands are dirty, you're playing too rough with me, or, stop touching my hair, kind of become excuses to scold and reprimand the child that are really ways to repel the threat of engulfment that the child is now posing to the borderline parent. And you can sort of imagine how confusing this can be for the child. So the person with borderline personality is faced with feeling re-traumatized throughout the course of most days, since transitions and their accompanying separations and reunions are just pretty frequent occurrences in most of our lives. And they'll likely split and see the other as either all bad and themselves as all good, or if they have no authority over the other, then they may see the other as the all good one and suffer with seeing themselves as all bad. And the child of the borderline parent is under the authority or power of that parent, so that they will often be made into the all bad one, or the scapegoat for the borderline to use the child in an abusive way that serves to manage that borderline parent's own feelings of rejection and abandonment and fear of engulfment. But if the borderline parent is married to a narcissistic spouse, then that spouse may be perceived as the one with the power in the relationship. And so the borderline parent may blame him or herself when she or he feels abandoned by the narcissistic spouse. So for instance, a spouse with borderline personality may feel rejected and abandoned when the narcissistic partner leaves for work. But if that borderline parent fears being even further rejected by blaming and attacking the character of the narcissistic partner, then the borderline parent may just endure feeling like that all bad person in the relationship. And what will often happen in such instances is that borderline parent will redirect these feelings into a relationship where they actually do have the power. And this is where the borderline parent may redirect that sense of helplessness at being all bad to the narcissistic spouse towards the child, over whom, of course, the borderline parent has authority, and sort of use that child as a way to return the parent themselves to feeling like they are all good and having someone else be the one who is all bad. And tragically, it can be the child to the borderline parent. So what's the difference between narcissistic versus borderline personality disorders? Well, I think in general terms, borderline personality is about maintaining faltering attachments, while narcissistic personality is about maintaining faltering self-esteem. And narcissists have a more stable, though fragile, sense of self that really disavows dependency on anyone else due to the shame involved, and that sense of self is artificially inflated. But so long as the narcissist can coerce others to fulfill their sense of entitlement to being treated as more special and important than others, then they may enjoy a sort of pseudo sense of buoyancy, though empty at the core, that maybe can seem more stable over time and situation than the person with borderline personality. Because in contrast, the person with borderline personality disorder is extremely sensitive to transitions that are commonplace in life. So they're going to look and seem much less stable in their emotions, thoughts, and behaviors than a lot of narcissistic personalities. And when they perceive someone to have wronged them, then they can grow in rage. So screaming tirades, physical and emotional abuse, and the like are commonplace at the hands of someone with borderline personality disorder. And someone with borderline can often pay attention to power dynamics in relationships so that they know with whom they can, in essence, get away with such displays. But once they feel empowered and able to treat the other without fear of retribution, that may be when they feel permitted to unleash whatever they want towards that unfortunate person. Just to illustrate, children who survived a parent with borderline personality can often recall that parent switching on a dime from going from, say, yelling at that child for some perceived transgression to someone else sort of from outside the home coming and instantly turning and saying, "Oh, hi," and really changing their tone and being very sweet to that person. One client gave the example, again, an anonymized client, fictional, of the parent back in the days of landlines yelling at the child extremely harshly and abusively, and the phone ringing, the landline ringing, and then picking the phone up and in the same breath saying, "Oh, hi, I'm so glad you called," and so on. And that sort of topsy-turvy switching from one moment to the next, unfortunately, is common with a parent with borderline personality. So a narcissistic person may go for longer periods of time in a state of kind of pseudo-stability, whereas the person with borderline personality disorder will be way less likely to be able to keep it together for as long. There's just too many triggers that the person with borderline personality disorder is susceptible to, and there's no real resting, peaceful state for them to occupy. If they feel the threat of abandonment is not immediate, it will likely still feel as if it's right around the corner. What does borderline personality disorder look like in a parent? I want to give an example of the mother of, again, a fictionalized client that we'll call John. who came to therapy to work through the impacts of borderline abuse suffered at the hands of his mother. And John described his mother as never being happy with him in a way he could trust. That, she might laud him for bringing home an A on his report card in the 3rd grade, but after the gleam of that moment wore off, she was likely going to yell at him for not doing some chore around the house that she'd supposedly asked him to do. And this really illustrated her fear of engulfment kicking in after she felt sort of too close to her son by paying him this compliment. And John would recall her having nightly screaming bouts at his father, which centered around the father's refusal to kind of emotionally connect with her in the way that she insisted was necessary for a happy marriage, which in therapy came to be understood as her fear of abandonment, resulting in seeing her husband as all bad and herself as a sort of all good victim. And John recalled his mother seeming perennially disappointed with his father or her husband until John's father finally left her for another woman. And at that point, though, John recalled his mother trying to woo his father back. And there, we could really piece together how his mother switched from seeing her partner, John's father, as the all bad one, to seeing herself as all bad and him as all good, and her sort of needing to create a reunion with him in order for her to feel better, that she now felt abandoned by him, and the only thing to make herself feel better was to recover what she had lost, in essence, John's father. Well, life with a mother with borderline personality disorder was very difficult for John. His mother began to thwart his efforts to make friends at school by insisting that she get to speak to the parents of any kid that he might want to hang out with. And this felt really humiliating to John, but his protests were met with her indifference, and ultimately he ended up avoiding relationships and friendships because of the trouble his mother would have caused him if he pursued them. And John would recall that when his mother would get home after work, there'd usually be a time of sort of good humor as she made dinner, but then as dinner progressed, she would unfailingly find some fault in him or his actions that would lead her to explode into a rage at him, where she would assassinate his character for being selfish, inconsiderate, or somehow uncaring about the family. And again, we understood this as sort of her fear of engulfment kicking in after a period of kind of like goodwill or good feeling between John and his mother. And in John's therapy, it was concluded that his mother felt sort of free to unleash her rage and devaluation at him because of the power she held over him as his mother. That he was unable to effectively fight back due to his, in essence, dependency on her at the time, so she did not have to fear retribution for her bouts of tormenting him. And I think this also illustrates the lack of empathy for others' feelings that's also exhibited by many people with borderline personality when they need to use another person in order to sort of patch up their fragile psychology and emotional state. The person with borderline personality is sort of utterly disinterested in how this usage of the other might actually be affecting that person. Well, I hope you found today's illustration of what abuse suffered by a parent with borderline personality can look like, what it means to have, or what borderline personality disorder is. Because if you've suffered from it, as I've mentioned, it can be incredibly confusing, and it can really kind of undermine one's own sense of feeling like a good and decent person, sort of at one's core, because it's there's so many efforts by the borderline or the parent with borderline personality to disturb the survivor's sense of their own goodness. Well, thanks for watching today, and I look forward to posting again next Sunday. And I want to thank everyone again for your continued engagement with the channel via posting comments and also responding to one another's comments, particularly as people have shared some of their own stories in their process of recovery in their particular, in essence, bad childhood. And the kind of really heartwarming and often touching efforts people are making to recover from that and kind of live the lives that you all deserve. that we all do. So that being said, I'll see everyone next Sunday. Take care.